Howdy, welcome to the Brand Archive, a podcast by the good kids where we dive into nostalgic brands, find out what went well, what didn't go so well, and what we can learn from it along the way. I'm Ben.
And I'm Ashton.
Today we're opening the archive on a legendary lifestyle brand. That's right, we're talking Marlboro.
Yes, we are. And that's why you got your cowboy hat and everything else, right?
I'm dressed as the Marlboro Man. Hold on a second here. So, could you imagine if I just lit up? We can't do that anymore, can we?
Not technically, no.
I thought about actually lighting this Marlboro cigarette I have here today with me. I might use it as more of an accentuating, when I have a good point, I'll kind of talk like, but I thought about lighting it, and then I realized, I don't know if we would get our deposit back if I did that.
Yeah, on our lease. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so we live in a time now where we can no longer have cigarettes indoors. Mm-hmm. And this is such an interesting thing, and I just realized this, but there was a time where women couldn't smoke outdoors.
Like at all.
At all. Mm-hmm. Ashton, do you have any experience with cigarettes, or do you have any experience with Marlboro, the brand? Maybe the brand is more broad than cigarettes.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had some really cool story about how in middle school some kids approached me and I had my first cigarette, but it really never happened, and I never even had to say no, honestly.
Oh, no.
If I just hung out with just goody two-shoe type kids or what, but no, so I don't have any experience with cigarettes.
Okay.
But the brand itself, I mean, that box to me is the staple of cigarettes. Like if you asked me to draw cigarettes, I would draw the Marlboro box.
Interesting. So it's, and I would agree with you 100%. Even when I want to draw a cigarette, it always has this yellow little end on it, which I just realized doing the research on this that that's not always the case either. But that's interesting. I grew up with cigarettes, and it was always a temptation for me because I always knew it was always a cooler thing to do. If you were kind of a cool kid, you maybe experimented, you dabbled with these cigarettes. This was before vapes.
Yes,
if you can imagine.
Yes, yep.
And my mom was a rebellious Marlboro woman, and so she collected the miles, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but some of my better memories of Marlboro was Christmas time, when I would get kind of like a cool Marlboro thing for Christmas. Like I got a sleeping bag one time.
As a kid, you got this stuff?
Yeah. So when when you are smoking cigarettes, you would get on the side you'd get 5 miles. That was it was called.
Okay.
And this was a marketing campaign when it became illegal to advertise cigarettes. Anyway, this was their way around it at the time. But she would collect miles. She'd staple like a certain amount, like 100 miles together or whatever. And I remember the little bin full of miles. And then, you know how some kids get the catalog in the mail? They get the Target catalog, and then they circle like, oh, I hope I get this monster truck. I hope I get this Furby. I got to circle the things in the Marlboro book.
Wow, I never realized that they had so much collateral.
Yeah, so they had a book that you could trade these miles in for 200 miles for a coffee cup. I don't know.
Interesting.
I don't know. Yeah, so that's that's probably my core memory with Marlboro. Should we get into the history of how it started?
Yeah, there was a lot that I did not know about until looking into it. The first of which is the founder's name, Philip Morris. He started Philip Morris Company in 1847, so this is like a long time ago. But it's kind of like any product that gets famous, right? You have no idea who the parent company or the founder is. You just know that product name, right?
Right. I don't know too much about Philip Morris, but did they start with cigars?
I know that they started production on cigarettes in particular in 1924. So yeah, maybe they had other products in addition to that, but it wasn't until the 20s that they got started. And I guess what was most surprising to me, given what we know today about the brand, is that these guys were originally designed for women,
Yes.
which I kind of love actually.
Yeah, no, it's like
So,
complete feminism, which is
yeah.
so fun. Their brand from the very beginning was about freedom. And at this time, it was illegal for women to smoke outdoors. But that blows my mind.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, there were a lot of really weird rules back then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course.
But to learn though that like even like the slogan was mild as May because they wanted to be this like, nice, gentle, pleasant, calm kind of aesthetic or vibe, right? To appeal to these women. Like that's such a polar opposite of what they are today.
Yeah, and this was before filters were common in cigarettes. So this part that's yellow on the cigarette is a giant filter. And back in this time, it was kind of a girly thing to do to have a filter on a cigarette. But Marlboro, because they were gearing their cigarettes towards women, they had filters on it. And then what color was the filter?
Well, I read that they had red tips. Is that what? Yeah. Yeah, so they had red intentionally because of women's lipstick so that it wouldn't mess up the cigarette.
Yes.
But I guess that in 1937 sales were just stagnant as can be.
Yeah.
So the whole let's attract women didn't go so well for them. This is, I mean, 13 years in. So they were totally being overshadowed by Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield. I think a lot of that too is just because of the culture, right? Like it wasn't proper for women to smoke. So unless you were like really bold and really out there and like one of a kind, you know, you're not the type of person who's going to go buy cigarettes.
Right. I mean, granted, like the flappers around this time, it was very in vogue to be a rebel in the 1920s and start of the 30s. So this was before the culture shift to the 1940s, which ended up being much more straight-laced. But in the 20s, it was pretty wild. So so they had the right idea, but the niche just couldn't support it. And I think a lot of it surrounded these weird rules, like if you're smoking, you have to be inside.
Sure.
So if they're smoking inside, then word can't get out that they're smoking Marlboros. And actually, before they made the shift, I want to touch on this. They actually had they paid women to walk the streets and smoke outside, like in a parade format. So
I love that. That's cool.
they did try. Marlboro actually would do these like conference where they would teach women cigarette etiquette, like how to smoke a cigarette. Sure. So that would have been fun for you, I think.
Is that like one of those things where you go and you have all your like place setting and you learn like where your fork goes and the cup that you use and like all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it would go salad fork, dinner fork, cigarette.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to transform it, but I mean, I'm not surprised because they wanted it to be more mainstream, right? So of course they probably had these etiquette classes.
Just trying to get the ball rolling. So these guys were great at marketing from the beginning. Yeah.
It just didn't take off, and then in the 1950, of course, that's when kind of this long chain of learning that smoking is bad begins. Right. Because that's when they first linked it to lung cancer, and so that's that huge shift. Also, I think they were just over the lack of sales and not hitting it with women, so that's when they first positioned marketing to men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the studies were showing that men were more susceptible to a risky lifestyle. Mm-hmm. They weren't as afraid of it as the women of the time. So it just made more sense to, when it became a scary, risky thing, to shift it over to the people who don't mind taking that risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yep, for sure. And then another kind of monumental moment in the 50s was that's when they first introduced the flip top box that we all use today.
Right.
And that was iconic at the time for the red and the white color scheme, and it was their first packaging change in over 40 years. So to me, that's like the first, like, yes, you can change your marketing, but if you're also like now implementing it in your packaging, like you're committing
Yeah.
to that move.
Right. And I think before this, they would come in a can and you'd unroll it like sardines.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll have to share some pictures of that. But the famous Marlboro Man advertising campaign that we know today started around the 1950s as well. And so they really made some like massive shifts, right? Their packaging, their advertising campaign. But the cowboy specific persona started in 1963 when it made its national debut, and they had all these rugged cowboys, right, in all of their advertising and packaging, and that's the famous campaign that we know today.
Right. I think this was the moment that they shifted from actors to real cowboys. So instead of having like a model come in and wear a cowboy hat like I'm doing today.
Yeah, like Ben.
Instead of that, they would actually hire real cowboys to come in. And so the Marlboro Man was a cowboy that embodied freedom, independence, and stoicism. So we went from feminine all the way, they like cranked it from 1 to 10 on this scale from masculine to feminine. And it's so interesting that they just took that risk and had confidence in themselves that they would be able to figure it out. And I actually wonder what it was like in the room when they came up with this idea, but they executed it, and their risk paid off.
Yeah, I mean, we know that they invested a lot into their advertising campaign, but it did pay off because their market share went from less than 1% to 40% of the market in just a couple of decades.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's one of the most successful campaigns of its time, I think. And then, of course, another bump had to happen, right? So in 1971, cigarette, TV, and radio bans go into effect. So then all of these companies have to move to print. And so that's why you see the national magazines just go off the charts with these cigarette ads.
Yeah.
And in Mad Men and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, and you'll kind of see they were just geared toward this sort of adversity because they were selling the cowboy, they could lean into the cowboy instead of like the cigarette, which is so smart for the industry that they were in.
Yeah, I mean, it really became a lifestyle brand of its time. And then we know that they became the world's best-selling cigarette in 1972. So that really didn't knock them down when it came to how they were going to appeal to people, because at that point, I mean, they had 20 years under their belt of this cowboy persona that people wanted to be a part of. Obviously, they're still today. In 2017, they were valued $88 billion, so they're still doing quite well. Even amongst, cultural shifts today, right? With smoking, we still know it's bad for you.
Yeah.
And vaping and all that. But they still try to innovate and be relevant. So they introduced heat sticks in 2017, which I had never heard of these things. Did you?
I'm not a vapor, so no, I definitely have not heard of heat sticks.
Yeah, and I guess they created a specific product called IQOS. Hopefully I'm saying that right. But it's not quite like a vape either. It's not a vape or an e-cigarette. It uses real tobacco, but instead of burning it, it heats it at a really low temperature.
Okay.
And that releases the nicotine vapor. But I guess it's not a vape.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. And it's so funny because the modern, we want we want this to be true so badly that we can smoke without consequences.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that this is clear over decades and decades that we are always like, now they're toasted. Oh, now they have a filter. Oh, now it's vape. Now it's a vapor.
Yeah.
How could it hurt you? But I think that they're still using the same tactics of Deception.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, yes, and you see that too because in 2021, the U.S. Trade Commission banned them, but then suddenly in 2024, they're fine now. I don't know. They're like okay to sell again. But I'm kind of shocked at the price. I honestly have never bought cigarettes, so I don't
Yeah.
know how much they are. But the device itself is $60, and then a tobacco stick is $8. To me, that's just like wildly expensive. I don't know how anybody keeps up with it. I guess that's how they still own 42% of the market, the cigarette market.
Do they really?
Yeah. Yep. And I guess it's probably because they have people that keep coming back for more.
Man, I almost started smoking after doing all this research. And one thing that is most interesting to me is you talked about the package that they developed. What year was that? I can't remember.
It was like 1950 or 54.
54. They have not changed their packaging very much, if any. They're still using that same flip top, but the top is red. That is still their biggest calling card. And it outlasted, I've always thought was their biggest calling card was the Marlboro Man. The Marlboro Man has faded, but that red chevron is still weathering the storm. So that's just fascinating to me how packaging has been one of their biggest salespeople.
Yeah, true. And it's stayed relevant.
Right. And even to this day, it stands out on the shelf. Like nobody is making a packaging that stands out more than that. And maybe that has to do with consistently being everywhere, like me looking for it. Maybe I know it, I'm familiar with it. But I also think that bold red next to the white and the cleanliness of the box really did a good job in pulling eyes towards it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe there's something about red and white. The guy who redesigned Campbell's soup packaging
Oh, yeah.
is the same guy who designed the box.
Right. He's a one-trick pony.
I guess. Yeah, he's just like red and white. It works.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously the
red
sales
over white.
Yeah, the sales back it. His name is Frank. Oh gosh, let's see if I can do this. Gianninoto.
Yeah, nailed it. Yep.
But yeah, I had no idea that he was a part of it. But the other thing that like I don't necessarily love or hate the logo, but I've always been surprised at the L and the B and like why they're so much taller.
Yeah.
Then, because in topography class, right, that's the cap height. Right?
Yep.
And so if it goes beyond the height of the M, it's kind of like breaking the rules. But
I'm gonna sound so silly. Is it like an
ascender?
Is it an extender?
Ascender,
Man,
I think.
Ascender.
Yes,
Maybe.
I think it's ascender.
Yeah, so actually, like, I think sometimes the L's and B's and do go over the cap height, but this is an extreme version of that. And the only thing that I have always thought of is that is perfectly placed with the chevron on their logo when the chevron is above it.
Kind of echoes that shape.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure why they did that.
If you know, let us know.
Yeah.
But one thing I think that's you noted this about the logo because we were talking about how it's still the logo today, right? And it was made almost a century ago at this point.
Right.
But they obviously went through this huge shift, and so that just points back to this idea that you can rebrand without touching the logo.
Yes.
That's just a piece of the puzzle, really.
Yeah, because they did do a logo. So they started off with a couple logos that aren't very memorable. You can look them up, but they really landed on something in 1932 with the current one with the ascenders that are too far up, right? And the funny thing is when we talked about it, Ashton, I was like, well, it is more masculine, so I see why they shifted. But then you were like, well, this happened before they rebranded.
They did, yeah.
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 And so it's so fascinating that the logo is simple enough to be pivotable. And I think that really helped them maintain the visual awareness or the equity in their logo while they were rebranding and telling a completely different story. Yeah. The fact that their logo is almost a blank canvas for the story that you're going to inject into it is brilliant. For most people, I think that this is a good idea, to come up with a logo that evokes more of a feeling than an exact idea of who you are and what you do. It is showing the feeling of who you are and just standing out. It can go a long way.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people want to blame the logo for all their problems, and they say, "Oh, we got to change it, we got to pivot." But like even to like this week, right? The Jaguar agency that did that rebrand got fired.
Oh.
And so that's an example of how they did a total pivot. They
I don't even know
the
about
logo. Yeah. They changed the logo entirely, but they lost all that equity that you just talked about, right?
Yep.
And so you can pivot too much and lose too much equity and get in real trouble. And so yeah, I think this was a great example of how they made that shift before they switched to their target audience today. But they were able to keep the equity and keep the recognition so that they could focus on the other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Focus on telling the story and injecting that logo with meaning. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. So let's talk a little about the differentiator. Mm-hmm. Ashton, what archetype do you think that Marlboro is?
They are most obviously the outlaw, for sure. So...
And I think that they did a really good job in bringing that to the forefront. Their main message is freedom. Mm-hmm. And, we already kind of talked about it, but they were the outlaw in helping women being able to smoke in public and just kind of alleviating these silly rules that the world put on them.
Mm-hmm. One thing I think that Marlboro does really well is they were one of the first lifestyle brands as a whole, because everyone at that time was kind of selling the product, what it is and the features. But they were really one of the first to they were almost selling this outlaw persona more than they were selling cigarettes.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
And that's a part of why it took off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering, why are they the only ones who invested in lifestyle branding? It seems like, in retrospect, obviously, seems like a no-brainer. and the more I looked up, the more I realized that other companies did try to be a lifestyle brand.
Sure.
Lucky Strike was taking the angle of we went to war, and it was all about, by the time the war was over was when Marlboro started really gaining power in the market. And Lucky Strike started taking the angle of the avid hunter and the sophisticated urbanite. And both of these two were also in the women's market. Mm. So Lucky Strike was watering down their brand with not really knowing which target audience was the right one. So they were kind of bouncing back and forth, whereas Marlboro was very strong. We are all women, and then we're all men, right? So they swung really hard, whereas Lucky Strike kind of took this angle of like swinging just a little bit into the masculine with hunting and sophisticated urbanite, which wasn't as appealing to the masculine energy as the cowboy. Another company is Camel. Camel was kind of trying to do the rugged nature as well, and they had a very strong rugged brand. They leaned into the adventurer and like pilot energy.
Sure. Yeah.
And it just wasn't as compelling as the cowboy. Again, it wasn't as down to earth for the people who smoked on a regular basis.
Sure.
It was more of a lofty, like the adventurer and the pilot was more of a lofty, like daydream. Whereas the cowboy, when you're smoking a cigarette, you're like, I kind of am a cowboy, like, oh, but if you're smoking a cigarette and you're like, I'm kind of a pilot, it's like, well, it's just different. It had a different energy to it.
Yeah.
Camel ended up going with the cartoon camel. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen the cartoon one, but I've seen the camel.
Something Joe. I wish I would have looked up his name, but I think it's like Camel Joe or something like that.
Okay.
But it was kind of like this cool, angsty, youthful camel character. Mm-hmm. And it started appealing to like really young people, like kids.
Okay.
And so they got a lot of flack for appealing to too young of an audience. Whereas I think most cigarette companies were going after maybe the 18-year-old, 17-year-old kids. Joe Camel kind of went a little bit lower than that with that cartoony nature of it. So it was appealing to a really young audience.
Yeah.
There was a company that leaned into a more down-to-earth blue collar vibe, and they really invested in the NASCAR audience.
Yeah.
That was Winston, and Winston chose to do that. I think that was a really great niche, but it ended up being like the women of Marlboro's past. It was like too tight of a niche.
Okay.
And even to some of these blue collar guys, these NASCAR guys, they were still also loving the cowboy. So it was like, kind of like there was still a choice to be made there, right?
Sure.
And then there were things like Newport and Cool, who went into like more of the jazz scene, but it just wasn't as consistent as Marlboro. So so they did try. It's just nobody could do it as good.
Yeah. Well, and then you found this, but it was interesting that they carried this persona, across the globe.
Yes.
Right? Because they are a global company. I think it's sometimes that we forget because they're just like, oh, American cowboy, right? Mm-hmm. But it seemed like they were able to relate to different cultures in different countries all with the same persona. Yeah.
So something that's really important when you're gonna be a world company, you have to understand the cultures that you're injecting your product into. A cowboy in Japan doesn't mean the same thing as a cowboy in America. So as they put their product out to other places, like South America, they actually shifted to more of a gaucho. And I read that it was more of like an upward mobile gaucho, like he was kind of like on his way up,
He's being promoted.
Whereas the American cowboy just wanted freedom and adventure, this cowboy kind of wanted to succeed as a cow, In Europe, they utilized a sailor and a mountaineer, and then they invested heavily into F1 racing to influence that risk factor, to really double down on the risk factor. And you kind of see that same tactic going into things like energy drinks nowadays. You can see how Red Bull invests in racing sports to be like, too much caffeine's probably bad for you, but like so is racing a car at 250 miles an hour.
Yeah.
In Asia, it was a sophisticated traveler and cosmopolitan professional. Ooh. And in Arab countries, it was more of just like an open landscape. So it wasn't about the visuals, it was about the message. Mm-hmm. So they maintained that message of freedom and individuality, but shifted the visuals to tell that story to other cultures as they were moving in. Yeah,
and that's cool. And honestly, that's what you need to do if you're going to survive on a global level like that, right? Yeah. And so it's fun that they kind of unlocked it here, but then they were able to use it across the globe.
Right.
And that's the power of those archetypes, right? Is that personality. It might look slightly different in every country, but it's like by human nature, we can identify who those people are.
Right. Yeah, because the Good Kids, our brand in like France is Pirates. And a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah. Oh, man. Well, I think we have an ad today, right?
Yeah. Yes. Now a word from our sponsor.
This episode is brought to you by Timeless Radiance. When you've lived a full life, A smoky, mysterious jazz bar at 3 a.m. kinda life. You need a beauty routine that keeps up. That's where timeless radiance comes in. Thanks to the unconfirmed blend of serums, essences, and oils, I look 42. Chronologically, I'm 68. Vocally, somewhere between a haunted accordion and a garbage disposal. But baby, I glow. Some say smoking ruins your skin. I say, have you seen my cheekbones? Timeless radiance. Look like you quit years ago, even if you sound like you never did.
Wow, I think I need some of that beauty routine. Really, spruce up my voice.
Right. Well, I wonder if it would affect your voice.
I mean, probably.
Sounds dangerous.
Hey, that's a part of the product, right? I want to buy into the danger.
Yeah, the danger and the freedom of that.
Yeah, because you wouldn't mind if I talked to people with that voice, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
All right. So, like all the other episodes, we want to talk about some key takeaways that we can learn. And I think one thing that really stands out to me in learning that how they used to try to promote themselves to women is that as you're niching, which I'm a huge fan of, you always have to consider the cultural tone at that moment, because they were trying to target women at a time when it wasn't mainstream enough to be regularly smoking, right?
Yeah.
There were a lot of challenges for these women in their daily life, and so that having a cigarette just like wasn't something that was top of mind for them, and that's, I think, why it failed. I'd be really kind of curious to see if they targeted women today, or maybe had a campaign just for women today to see like if it would be successful or not, now that they have the equity and recognition and all that. Yeah. And it's not maybe as a taboo as it may have been at the time. I mean, I guess now we're going into vaping and all that, but it would be interesting to see what that would look like today. But again, I think, thinking about how we can apply that whenever you're choosing your niche, you have to be very careful and consider the cultural trends of the day. And so that's why something that we do from a brand strategy perspective is we look at the cultural context of the industry and just the world at large, because there's a lot of factors that can be impacting the audience that you're trying to appeal to, totally unrelated to your product or service, right? Yeah. If they are stressed out about something, maybe they won't buy. If their budget's tight from this totally opposite just like home situation, they're not going to buy. And so you just have to consider all of those factors when you're building a brand that you want to be well known.
Yeah, I love that part of the brand strategy that you do, Ashton, where it goes into regulatory, cultural, and it's almost like, yes, we understand what we can see here. This is kind of the goal, and this is the playground that we're in right now. But also, like, what's outside of the fences of our playground that could affect, like, what is the weather doing? Yeah. Right? Yes. And that's a pretty nuanced analogy there. But yeah, what is the outside of our goal, mission, and the playground that we're in? How is that going to affect our business? And it's something that not a lot of I don't ever remember a lot of people knowing right away when we get into that phase. It's something that we don't think about because we're so focused on where we're going that we don't look at the pulled back view of what the world looks like.
Yeah, because you could build something that's completely appropriate for your specific company, but it could totally miss the mark on a cultural level. Yep. And so it's just, it's really important to consider all of that before you invest in a brand. Yeah. The other thing, just from like a business perspective, I guess, that I really admire is that somehow they have overcome all these obstacles time and time again between like learning about how cigarettes are not healthy for you. There was some lawsuits that they faced. All those advertising restrictions that we talked about when you can't even do it on TV and radio. And then even just culture, like way back then, and now we have vaping and we have nicotine pouches. It's just, I don't know, kind of wild to me that, like you said, we have this product, we know it's bad, but they continue to use deception or this maybe idealism
Right.
to continue to be successful as a company. And honestly, I would maybe argue that they've been able to stay alive as long as they have with this specific product because of the brand.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
It's the lifestyle that they're promising you when you have one in your hand, right? It's not the product is terrible. 100%. I don't smoke, but if I ever do, you just feel a way because you have that brand with you. And that's what branding is it can make you feel a certain way. And so they have survived on that. It's a masterclass in what branding could do. It's a little bit of a darker story,
Yeah.
but you still can learn from that, understand what branding can do. The lifestyle and story is so much more important than the features. And especially when we're dealing with a brand that or a product that is not good.
It's not healthy for you.
Right. Because when these things would pop up, when a health scare would pop up, other brands would focus on, well, we're using filters now, so not a problem.
Yeah.
Or our tobacco is toasted, so not a problem. So this is a really bad thing for a brand to do because those things can be proven wrong. And when they are proven wrong, you lose all the trust. So other brands focused on like what I just said there, but they also focused on things like taste, or they would focus on just like how it looks, but they didn't focus on the story that they were telling. And so that's really where Marlboro shifted focus, and this is really great. And it's almost like what they did was they just changed the conversation. 100%. They said, yeah, they are dangerous, but you're like a dangerous guy, right? So
And that's cool.
That's kind of cool that you would like do a dangerous thing, and we can supply that for you. Right?
Oh yeah, they're not worried about it at all.
Yeah, so they were being honest, and so I think that's why their brand withstood a lot of these challenges, is because
They owned.
the negative thing.
Yeah.
And there's a great Mad Men episode where they're talking about Lucky Strikes. That's the brand that they're doing. And Pete Campbell comes to the meeting and he throws down this information from a study that says young men, they don't mind being risky, and they want to be risky. And Don Draper shuts him down and says, nope, they're toasted. We're gonna get around it by saying they're toasted. And it's easy for me to say in retrospect, like, that was a bad idea, Don Draper. But but yeah. So Don Draper always seemed like he was right in those episodes when I was watching when I was younger.
Yeah.
And now that I'm getting older, I'm realizing that Don Draper made a lot of mistakes.
It's really how he survived the mistakes that makes the show.
That is yes, 100%.
All right, our audience question was, did real cowboys smoke Marlboro?
Yeah,
Ben?
so Marlboro said, like, we're gonna steal the cowboy aesthetic, and you're a cowboy if you smoke one of these. But real cowboys rolled their own cigarettes. And more importantly, they probably didn't smoke as many cigarettes as you think. Most cowboys took a can of chewing tobacco into the field. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It doesn't get crushed. If you're carrying a saddle and you hit your pocket with the cigarettes in it and you destroy your cigarettes, it's like that sucks. If you are out and there's really dry out and you start lighting your cigarette, it can be kind of a fire hazard. It's not a huge fire hazard, and also just the ability to, if it's raining, if it's windy, you always have tobacco that you can just dip into your lip. Cigarettes were kind of a problem on the trail as far as I understand it. And any cowboy worth its salt would just roll its own cigarette. It wouldn't go into town and buy a box of Marlboro cigarettes that have a nice filter on it. Yeah, I think...
So the short answer is no.
The short answer is no.
Too many problems.
Too many problems, too expensive, so many things that a cowboy didn't really embody. Well, that's what we have on Marlboro. Join us next week as we run faster and jump higher? That's right, we're talking PF Flyers.
All right, perfect. Make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening. And then if you have some questions for us, be sure to reach out on social media. We love answering those questions on the episode. We'll see you next time.
Bye.